Okay, before I jump into the various topics, let me make a few important distinctions. Okay, first of all, there's a difference. A lot of times people nowadays use these terms interchangeably, and in fact, sarcastically, people will say, oh, there ought to be a law of such and such. But the way certain scholars use these terms, actually, that's a bit misleading, because before humans had the hubris to think they could just create what people nowadays call laws, there was this idea that there were regularities, there were certain rules of human behavior that were taboo to break or that were considered crimes. People knew that for thousands of years before the political authorities thought they had the right or the privilege or the authority or the competence to go and change what those rules would be. Okay, and so in terms of English language, I've seen people like Friedrich Hayek, for example, make the distinction between law and legislation. So in this context, then, law means rules of human behavior, especially things codifying what is and is not a crime, whereas legislation clearly refers to things that, statutory law, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, and so there always has to be law, right? That's unavoidable. You cannot have a society where people don't think in general it's a bad idea to go eat your neighbor, right? Cannibalism cannot be a regular occurrence, even in societies where they practice that. It can't just be everybody can just go out and do that sort of thing. It has to be circumscribed, even in cultures that practice it, and in general, that can't work. You can't have people walking around just killing each other. You can't have people going around thinking it's fine to just take whatever you want from your neighbor. You couldn't have a society that way. All right, so there's various ways historically, and I think Hayek in particular would make sort of an evolutionary argument and just say, if we look back through human history and see documents of societies and what kind of rules did they have, they all had law, because if they didn't, we wouldn't have any records of them, because they wouldn't have prospered, they wouldn't have flourished, and they wouldn't have certainly developed writing, so we would have no evidence of them. And they wouldn't have built big cities and so forth, so we would have, we wouldn't find ruins of their pottery and things like that. So there's that sort of argument, whether you're coming from a theological background or a natural rights, sort of using your human reason or whatever or if you're just a pure utilitarian, it doesn't matter. The point is, human societies need to have law, whereas this idea of legislation, that's one particular way that human societies, and it's relatively recent historically, have come up with creating those laws, but again, keep those things distinct. And so we're going to see a lot of that throughout these issues, because the big picture, the voluntary city, what am I talking to you about? I'm going to show you how a lot of areas where people just assume you need state provision of certain services or institutions relying on some monopoly coercive authority, that actually there's lots of ways, both theoretically and historically, we can see that those things could at least conceivably be provided through voluntary mechanisms. And so in that context, then, this distinction between law and legislation is pretty important. Okay, another huge distinction. There's a problem in the free market tradition of, and I think a lot of this comes from Ayn Rand, where the general public gets the idea that free market economists think basically humans are very selfish and self-centered and greedy and egotistical, and then the people who support political solutions are the ones who are altruistic and think people strive for the common good, and that's where people draw the battle lines. And that's, for one thing, it's not correct, so just if you don't like saying things that are false, don't say that. But also, strategically, that's a very silly move if you're a fan of free markets. You don't want to concede that, oh yes, my opponents are the ones who care about other people and have a very broad view of human nature, whereas we, people who favor markets, think that people basically just care about making a buck. If you say that, like I said, number one, I don't think it's true, but also number two is you're probably not going to convince very many people. And so what they do, they stress in this book, in the Independent Institute, just so you know, in general, is very good on this point, is to try to break away from that conventional dichotomy. And so here what that stands for is the distinction between for-profit business entities or institutions versus not-for-profits, okay? And it used to be, a while ago, people used to call it non-profits, and then they refined it to say not-for-profit to really stress that it's not so much whether they take in more money than they spend in a given year. It's rather the issue is what is the purpose of the institution? Are they trying to make a profit, which is fine for many places and many things, but what is the rationale? What's the nature of their enterprise? And also, it's more accurate too, because there are plenty of for-profit businesses that do not turn a profit, right? They screw it up. My business partner and I threw an event one time, and we lost a boatload of money, and then for the next year, he said, maybe we should think about making it a nonprofit. And I said, we already are a nonprofit. And then, so this kind of ties into the next one, that really there's a distinction between how we use this term, the market. And so some people, when they talk about the market, they mean for-profit businesses. And what they stress in this book, The Voluntary City, is to say we are here in this work going to be trying to paint a picture of a broader image, and we'll call it civil society. So the connection between the two is voluntarism, all right? That there is, and we'll talk later about how do we, for stuff to be voluntary, you have to know who's got the property rights. But given, if you just accept for the sake of argument right now, that we have well-defined property rights and people know whose stuff is what and who has the authority to make decisions over these pieces of property, then to say it's voluntary means no matter how noble your goal is, you cannot just take other people's stuff without their consent. You can't have just a vote and say, well, we think that this land here should be devoted to this public purpose unless the actual owners of that land agree with you. Okay, and so the broad term they use for that is civil society, to encompass both for-profit and not for-profit enterprises. So again, just to explain why is this important rhetorically, because there are plenty of things, as we'll see in these topics, where there is definitely what's called a market failure if, and that normally many economists, mainstream economists, people who aren't particularly identifying with the classical liberal or the libertarian tradition, there are plenty of economists who will say, yeah, markets are great as a general rule. If you want to talk about getting apples to consumers, if you want to talk about making television sets or automobiles, markets are great for that sort of thing. They do a great job of aggregating information and lining up incentives and so forth, channeling people's greed into socially useful outcomes. But there's this whole range of stuff that falls under the rubric of what's called market failure, where there's negative externalities or there's positive externalities, there's this, that, and the other thing, there's natural monopolies and so forth. And so they think that in these arenas, the market provision of this stuff doesn't work very well, and therefore they conclude we need the state to come in and either lay down regulations or provide this stuff. And so that's why this distinction is so important, and tying into this one is to realize, yes, it's true. If there are things where it doesn't quite work to have a business whose purpose is to make a monetary profit, charging customers a price, and then providing these things, it's true, there are a lot of things where that model doesn't work very well, but it doesn't mean, therefore, you need coercion. It could mean there's a scope here for a not-for-profit institution doing that. Okay, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, a lot of the way to solve these alleged market failures, even within the context of for-profit businesses, is to just broaden it and have an entity own a bunch of the real estate and to try to what's called internalize the externalities. Okay, so that's going to be one theme throughout this, and if you read The Voluntary City, you'll see that's a theme going throughout it, is to a lot of these alleged difficulties with the free market providing something. You'll see that they can get around that if they have not just that one thing being narrowly provided by a business, but instead have an entity own a bunch of the land, and then they can have lots of things going on that land, and they can capture the spillover consequences. So in case that seems like science fiction, let me just run through some obvious real-world examples where you see this happen all the time, so you can realize, okay, this isn't just some nutty idea that a libertarian economist dreamed up. Okay, something as simple as hotels. All right, if you think about it, there's a hotel, especially like a really big one, is like a mini city. All right, and they explicitly develop that analogy in this book, where they have transportation service, they have elevators and so forth. They have different living quarters. There's plumbing. If you're in a hotel and the toilet stops working and you call the front desk, they probably, especially if it's a big hotel, are not going to outsource that to somebody else. They have somebody on staff that comes up and fixes that. They, again, for large hotels, have their own security. If there's a fight that breaks out on the 8th floor somehow, they're not going to just call the police and wait for the police to show up. They're going to have their own people go there and quickly diffuse the situation. They obviously have all kinds of utilities. It's not that you're not going to have light and so forth. So all the things that you think of as what you need in a modern city environment, they have lots of it. They have workstations with Wi-Fi connections and things like that. They have restaurants. They have even common areas, things that traditionally would be considered as public goods like parks and water fountains and so on. Again, in really fancy hotels, you have that distinction between, here's a common area where there's the nice fountain and people are sitting around on the couches and whatever, like in the lobby area, but then you can also retreat to your own private room where other people from the hotel are not allowed to go into there because that's your room. Okay, so a lot of those distinctions that we see handled in the broader literature, you can see that there's a context in the hotel where we all just realize, well, yeah, of course the hotel can provide that. That's not an issue. So nobody would possibly suggest that you need the government to come in and make sure that hotels have fountains, because how could a hotel possibly charge people enough to pay for the fountain? That's silly that they roll that into the purchase price. And notice too, they don't separately charge you. It's not like if you go and are looking at the fountain in the hotel while you're waiting for your dad to go get your luggage, the bellhop doesn't come up and say, hey, that'll be $2 for looking at that fountain, right? So they somehow make it work where they charge their customers enough. And so if you just again think through the logic of that, obviously it's because they can, if somebody comes in off the street and is just sitting there using the services of the hotel, going to the ice machine and whatever, and that person's not a customer of the hotel, eventually someone's going to kick them out. All right, and so that's the way they deal with that. Okay, another common example is what are called office parks, right, where you have developers will come and they'll buy a bunch of land, then they'll build office space, they'll have nice parking lots, and then I couldn't find a great example of a picture to show you, but there's ones where they even have common areas, like, again, fountains and whatever, or big lakes or whatever, and sometimes they have to do that just because of the the vagaries of clearing out the land to build the stuff. They have to make a natural waterway anyway, and so they roll it all into one so that there's this huge area. So when you go to work, it's this very nice looking environment, and it's like a little mini city. And they might even, depending on how big it is, it might make sense to have a bunch of restaurants or whatever, so that the people who work in these buildings don't have to drive 5 miles away. They can all just stay there and not take huge lunch breaks. Okay, so again, a lot of the things that in the standard economics literature are considered to be market failures and things that couldn't possibly be provided by private business can be if it's one business that owns the whole thing and then sells, leases out office space to individual businesses that come in and realize, oh yeah, it would be good if we just rented out whatever, one floor in one of these buildings and had our whole operation here, and they just weigh the pros and cons and figure, should we stay here with all the amenities that this office park has to offer? Okay, and so that's, again, an example that this isn't science fiction. Okay, another obvious one is Disney World. When we went there, I was a little kid, and we're going on the tram and all that stuff. I mean, so it is clearly a city. It's like a kingdom, a magic kingdom, if you will. And they have, again, it's not just the rides and things like that. There's all kinds of food. There's all kinds of stuff, but they even have modern transportation systems, all sorts of infrastructure. And my dad was sitting. We were on the, what did they call it? I don't know if they call it the monorail, but we were on whatever that tram thing was. And my dad was like, I just can't believe how they move these people around. All right, and so most people were concerned about Space Mountain. My dad was amazed by the subway version that they had there. So that's why I turned out like this, because he was my dad. So, but again, the point is, and I grabbed this one in particular because of the fireworks. Because again, that is allegedly something that private businesses could not possibly finance, and you need to have local governments to have firework displays because they're considered a public good. Well, again, if you have a business that owns enough of the real estate so that you can contain it and exclude people who are not paying for something, that's one way you can contain that. And then notice here, it's not that Disney World, again, goes around and at night when the fireworks and the laser light show starts, they don't go up and down and hit everybody up for a contribution to fund that stuff. And it's, or that at admission they charge you different prices, and then they go around and make sure, and if you didn't pay enough, they make you wear a blindfold when the fireworks show is going on. the point is, it's, the way the numbers work, it is profitable for them to just offer that as an amenity because they make up for it that more people want to go to Disney World knowing when it gets to be night, there's a cool laser light show. And so they'll pay more, and that's how they have accountants and stuff, and they got to figure that stuff out. Obviously, they're not going to spend an extra $10 million on the fireworks show. At the margin, that might not make sense. They might not make enough more revenue from their customers to make the laser light show and fireworks show that much cooler. But the point is, they have decided it makes sense to have it at all. Okay, and then I think the greatest example of this sort of thing are cruise ships. How many of you have actually been on a cruise, just out of curiosity? You guys haven't lived. What's wrong with you? Or you're just not awake yet. Okay, so you go on a cruise, and everybody should just go on at least once to see it because it's amazing, again, as an economist, to see it is a floating city. They have everything, they have to, because otherwise people would be dying. They have food, obviously, sanitation, plumbing. If people get sick, there's doctors aboard and so forth. Okay, and there's all sorts of amenities. I was trying to find one that could show you. I mean, they got a pool area. They got all kinds of, DJs doing stuff. They got, little silly contests. Which of our passengers has the hairiest chest? That kind of silly stuff. What kind of city could get along without such a contest? And so that's, again, an example of things where it's a private business providing these things that, in the standard literature, the way they discuss it, this sort of thing would be impossible. So now for all these, of course, it's not that mainstream economists were unaware of the existence of hotels and office parks and cruise ships. It's just that's not normally the way they were thinking of it. But the point is that we're making is that these things show you can have voluntary provision of all sorts of things that typically are considered to be something that requires coercive state provision. And what is the common theme in all this stuff? It's that the business in question owns a big enough area of the land space, or the floating land space here, because that's what you want to think of the ship, so that they can exclude people who are not paying. And they're not charging people for the individual availability necessarily of each service. It's a package deal. Okay, so some things that are considered to be generic public goods that cities would want, if it's near the coast, lighthouse, playgrounds. We talked about fireworks, but let me just make a few distinctions here. Strictly speaking, a public good in the economics literature, and I think someone mentioned that maybe you guys have already heard this, I'll just do this fast, that somebody earlier this week had talked about this. The two criteria are what's called non-rival in consumption, and the other one is non-excludable. So for a pure public good, they need to have both of those attributes, and so you can see why fireworks fit that pretty much, because given that the local government's going to put on a July 4th firework display, they can't very well say only residents in this area are allowed to look at this and other people aren't. It's just impractical. You can't do that. And also, so that's the non-excludable part. And the non-rival in consumption means that if you're watching the fireworks display and your neighbor comes out in his lawn chair and he's looking up too, it's not that your enjoyment of it goes down. Okay? Whereas with what the literature refers to as strictly private goods, neither of these is true. Right? So if there's a piece of pizza there, you very easily can determine who gets to eat it or not. And if I eat a piece of it, my neighbor can't eat the same piece, right, because it's gone. Right? So that's the distinction. But however, a lot of people are sloppy, and something like this park here, actually that is excludable. You could imagine putting a fence around it or something and charging admission for people to come in and drop their kids off. So what they mean in that context is to say, well, it's not very practical, or given what the thing is, it would just be much more enjoyable. People don't want to have to pay admission to take their kid to the local playground. Okay, so I'm just saying that in case you haven't heard that distinction, understand why is it that some people will loosely refer to something like that as a public good, when if you know the definition, you say, wait a minute, you could easily exclude somebody from that. So why are they calling it that? That's partly what they mean. And the other issue is the non-rival in consumption. What they also could mean is for a given level of congestion, right? So up to a point, so long as not too many people are trying to use the playground at the same time, having one more kid running around is not going to take away the enjoyment of earlier kids who showed up, but it's true at some point it gets crowded. And so I'm just explaining why people who might call that a public good, what they mean by that. Another distinction, if you really want to get into this literature, is what's called a club good, which is more accurate for some of these. So that would mean something that where you can exclude people from. Okay. Social insurance. So let's talk about. So now I'm in the area of goods and institutions to be provided. So I'm just going to run through a sequence of institutions or goods that a lot of people typically think this requires either explicit regulation to make sure the market does it correctly or outright provision by state authorities. And so I'm going to run through and show you theoretically and historically examples of voluntary provision of these things. Okay, so right now a lot of people, the standard narrative in the United States is, thank goodness FDR came along in the 30s and gave us Social Security and then later, they brought in Medicare and Medicaid, because before then, again, this is the narrative, people were completely helpless in their old age, or if they got sick, if a breadwinner died early on, and so we needed the government to come in and provide this stuff so people didn't have to worry about becoming destitute, and all advanced societies have mechanisms like this. And so it's unfortunate that the U.S., with its laissez-faire heritage, took until the 1930s to finally get on board and provide this basic service. Okay, so as you can imagine, people in the free market, classical liberal tradition say there's a lot wrong with that narrative. So one thing is just the incentive, so in terms of the economics of it, I'll just be brief on this point. As I'm sure many of you know, if you measured like the internal rate of return on your Social Security contributions, and I'm putting quotations because it's taken out of your paycheck whether you want to or not, it's horrible. All right, compared to if you took the same amount out of your paycheck and put it into even just something like a really safe bond fund, you would earn a lot more than what you're getting in terms of the promised benefits later on when you retire, if you run the numbers and see. And the reason for that, among other things, is they're not investing your money. It's not that the government is taking the money out of your paycheck for Social Security for your retirement and then going out and buying bonds or stocks with it and just maintaining that for you. What's that?
They're buying the treasury bonds.
Right, so it's the government is saying, they're spending the money and then they're saying, don't worry, we will pay you later on. Right, so the so-called Social Security Trust Fund is just the government saying, we got this, don't worry. Right, so it's equivalent financially to them just saying we'll pay for your retirement if you give us this money now. So I'm saying it's the government does not have external assets. The way they're going to fund that is by taxing people down in the future. Okay, so as opposed to a private pension fund or whatever that's relying on external assets. So that's one reason in terms of the rate of return being so abysmal. And then the other thing is you got to be careful looking at retirement planning and so on. A lot of people will say, without Social Security, it would be, the private provision of this stuff is clearly lacking. People are not saving enough. Look at how low the savings rate is. Look at what people's retirement planning is. And they would have statistics saying, if we didn't have Social Security, X% of Americans would only have this amount, available at retirement. So this is clearly fulfilling a valuable social service. The problem, though, there is people take this into account. When people are saving on their own and deciding how much do I put into my 401k or whatever, other retirement plans, they're taking into account that they're going to be paid Social Security, or they estimate, what do I think I'm going to get paid when I retire? So just be careful. You can't assume because the government has come in and started this program that therefore that's just pure gravy. People do respond to that. But as far as historically, a lot of what they talk about in this book, The Voluntary City, is voluntary associations. And there's different types of them. There's fraternal organizations, and there's also what's called mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations. And the word fraternal does not just mean provided by men. There were also organizations founded by women also many of this had religious overtones that they called fraternal organizations just, because the name stuck. So let me just read you something here from Tocqueville. So he came and was looking at the United States in the 1830s in his famous survey. So this is Alexis de Tocqueville talking. He says, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. The Americans make associations to give entertainment, to found seminars, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books. Wherever at the end of some new undertaking you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States you will be sure to find an association. Okay, so again, he's stressing there that the different ways those three countries address this sort of stuff. So it's, again, what I want you to see is this distinction. Some real aggressive free market people come off as saying that, hey, sink or swim, like a social Darwinist type of attitude. People got to provide for their retirement, and if they don't, or if the breadwinner dies, then tough luck. And you don't need to say that. You don't need to be a tough guy like that. You could admit that, yes, there is a need in a humane society for institutions that take care of people who are poor, who maybe made poor life decisions, or who just get struck with some rare disease or things beyond their control. And we don't want to, as a society, sit back and just let those people die in the street. You don't need to go to that view if you're against state provision of these things. You can say there's a role for voluntary philanthropic organizations to come in and provide that stuff. So de Tocqueville, again, saying in France, typically they would handle these things through the state. In England, it would be like the nobility people would do it to sort of prove what great states people they were and to earn a reputation. In the U.S., they did it through associations. Let me read this. This is from the New Hampshire Bureau of Labor in 1894 report. This quote says, "The tendency to join fraternal organizations for the purpose of obtaining care and relief in the event of sickness and insurance for the family in case of death is well nigh universal. To the laboring classes and those of moderate means, they offer many advantages not to be had elsewhere." Okay, so again, these are the ways things were provided. I do some consulting work in the life insurance sector, and there, to this day, there's a dichotomy between what's called stock companies and what are called mutual companies. And that distinction, so what it means nowadays, if you're going to go buy a permanent life insurance policy, is that the stock companies have stockholders, and the mutual companies, it's like the individual policyholder owns it. And this traces back to the 1800s, where the first life insurance organizations in the U.S. were not stock companies. It was partly because they couldn't get, there were difficulties with charters from England, like going way back, and that's where this tradition came from, where the Crown didn't want to grant stock ownership. So you still had a bunch of people. They still had people dying unexpectedly and early, so you still had a need for life insurance. And so what would they do? They'd have these mutual aid societies, these mutual life insurance associations. And so everybody in the group would say, we're going to kick in premiums, and then if somebody in this group dies, we'll give a payment to that person's next of kin to help for burial and to maintain if it's a widow now who has to raise kids. Okay, so these things were provided through voluntary mechanisms in all sorts of different varieties. Zoning regulations, this again is one where the conventional wisdom is very superficial and overlooks the reality of what happens with government provision. So here is in the context of a city, what I want to talk about is when they zone an area to be either commercial or residential. Okay, so in many urban areas right now, they'll have this, the city is distinguished, segregated, so that certain areas are where people live and certain areas have businesses, and those two don't interlap. And that was, historically, it wasn't like that. Historically, before these regulations were laid over, you would have, there'd be a storefront on the ground floor, and then maybe the owners would live right above it. And there would be other tenants and so on. So like it'd be an apartment complex with a little grocery store all in the same building. Whereas, You think about nowadays in many modern cities, you wouldn't see something like that. That would look weird to you to see people living interspersed with the commercial businesses because, again, it's zoned. So what the rationale for that is, people are saying, oh, well, we want to separate that. We don't want to have all this commercialism. We want to have businesses distinct so people can live in peace over here and then have the commercial stuff over here. But there's actually a lot of downsides to that. So a huge name in this literature is Jane Jacobs. So if you're interested in the topic of what's called urban planning, she's a giant in this area, and definitely encourage you to go look up her stuff. So her first classic work was The Death and Life of Great American Cities that came out in 1961. And just a very brief summary of her perspective, she was an opponent, so she was based in the New York City area, and she was an opponent of Robert Moses in particular. She battled with him a lot. So if you are from that area, you might know like there's the Robert Moses Parkway and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff there named after him. So he was a big urban planner, and she was a champion of like the local communities, right? So there was one incident where they were going to try to build a highway through Washington Square Park, and they were opposing it. And so a lot of her work is to show the unintended consequences of so-called urban planning, and she wasn't coming at it from like an ideological perspective. It wasn't that she didn't like the government per se. It's that she could see these communities and study them up close and saw how they worked and realized when these outsiders come in thinking they know better and they're going to offer a top-down plan to improve things for the local residents, they overlook stuff, and there's a lot of things they don't get right. So, for example, when they build a huge highway through a city, first of all, they kick people out. They use eminent domain to seize the apartments and whatever people who are living in the path of this new proposed expressway. So that's sort of unfair on the face of it. But also then it would divide that area up, and a lot of times after the thing went through, you would see one side of the highway now would sort of be off in no man's land, right? They would be cut off from the rest of the community, and then crime would rise and things would happen there, and it would turn into like slum areas because they weren't taking into account the fact of how much the community relied on those relationships, and you build this huge thing right through there and sort of cuts it off, what's going to happen? So that was part of what she was doing. She had, but as far as this issue of zoning regulations, so she had a couple of neat phrases: eyes on the street, and ballet of the sidewalk. And more generally, this is now, like in this literature, people would refer to this as natural surveillance. And what she meant by this was an unintended consequence of a lot of these regulations to try to segregate the living quarters from the commercial buildings, if you think about it, is that now there weren't a lot of people watching. If you don't have residents who lived in and among these businesses, there are fewer witnesses. And so she was pointing out how this perversely could cause crime to go up, right? That I don't know if you guys have, if you go to downtown Chicago, the business sector, after 7 p.m. on a weekday, it just clears out. There's nobody around, okay? And if you're walking around, all of a sudden you got to start paying attention, keep your wits about you, because you realize if somebody jumped out of the corner and mugged me, there's nobody around, okay? That didn't happen, that sort of scenario, back when people lived in and among all the businesses, right? Because at any given time, there's kids playing in the street, there's mothers looking out to make sure the kids are still within sight and so on. So there's not this just desolate area. And that's partly what she's talking about, the eyes on the street. Incidentally, that's also one of the, people have studied the problems when the government imposes a curfew. There's an area where there's high crime, and sometimes they come in and impose a curfew to get people off the street, and they'll see that, certain studies have shown relatively innocuous crimes like, graffiti and stuff like that go down, but then more serious crimes go up. And the theory is to explain that is to say, yeah, if you have a bunch of hooligan teenagers out, they're going to do stuff like maybe shoplifting and graffiti and things like that. And if you force them to go home after 8 p.m. or something, yeah, you'll cut down on that stuff. But then there aren't any witnesses around for the more serious crimes. So that's partly what Jane Jacobs was focusing on, saying she was one of the pioneers in this area to say a lot of what determines the crime rate in an area has to do with the likelihood of you being able to commit that and get away with it. And one of the main factors there is, are there a bunch of people standing around? So if there's a bunch of teenagers hanging out playing loud music on the corner or something, and maybe the residents don't like that, that might be annoying to some people, but then it means someone's not going to get kidnapped right there, okay, or get pulled into the corner and get mugged because those teenagers are sitting right there, they can see it. Here's what Jane Jacobs, this is an excerpt from her book. She says, "It may be that we have become so feckless as a people that we no longer care how things do work, but only what kind of quick, easy outer impression they give. If so, there is little hope for our cities." Okay, so again, what her perspective was, it wasn't like she was ideological and didn't like the government. She really loved American cities, thought they were the lifeblood of the economy in general, and her career was spent studying how do American cities actually work, and she realized when these, let me use a provocative phrase, like these social do-gooders come in thinking they're going to fix the problems of the cities, and there undoubtedly were problems, they end up causing much bigger problems because they don't really know what they're doing. And so in that quote, she was lamenting the fact that she could point stuff out, and these people apparently didn't care, right? That it was more important to them to have the appearance of doing something to make the city better rather than actually, is this doing what you say it's going to do? So another great example of this is so-called affordable housing initiatives. So if you have been to a big city, you've seen some of these housing projects, you can see that they're very imperious. They look like huge prisons, some of them. And this was another area where Jane Jacobs was very critical. So just to give you the contrast, the way they were often designed was you'd have high-rise and low-income residents, right? So the government would come and build these huge things, and then there would be income requirements to say, in order for you to be eligible to come live in one of these things, because we're going to provide charge very low rent, you have to show us, demonstrate that you make a low income, because that's the whole rationale. The government thinks, here we're going to make affordable housing. It's really expensive to live in Manhattan, let's say, or in other boroughs, and so we'll build an apartment complex and charge below market rents, and that's what we'll do as the government to try to alleviate this problem of unaffordable housing. But the problem is, again, in practice, they would build these monstrosities like this, and so Jane Jacobs pointed out that, and these things empirically, there was a lot of crime associated around them. And so they would lower the property values of other buildings in the area, and people would move away from them, and it would just cause this downward spiral, and so you weren't really helping these people. Instead, drug dealers would be around the area and things like that, and so it was clearly not working very well, and so she was trying to put her finger on it and say, what's going on? She said part of the problem is these things are high-rise, low-income, so she would have recommended instead low-rise, mixed income. And so she's saying part of the perversity, the unintended consequence of this approach is, if you've got the parents people up there, they can't watch their kids. They can't see what's going on, and so there's little monitoring by the residents, the rank and file residents of the building. And so if there is a drug gang or something that starts hanging around, these people can't really watch them very well, whereas if it's lower, especially if there's businesses interspersed, then you have more of a natural environment, and it's harder for certain things to snowball. Okay, so that's, again, you can see the perversity of the government thinking it's doing a good job helping these certain communities when it ends up exacerbating the problem. If you've been in this area a lot, one of the catchphrases when you talk about private provision of stuff is people say, oh, who will build the roads? Okay, and so in this book, there's a whole section on turnpike provision, private provision, and it is true that they were not particularly profitable. All right, so what would happen is historically an association would spring up, just like the ones Tocqueville talked about, for, in this case, building a turnpike, connecting areas. And it was interesting, with my time here, I'm not going to read you the excerpts, but people would write very guilt-trippy letters to their neighbors, like prominent members of the community, saying, hey, I've seen you haven't contributed to the Turnpike project yet, and I'm surely you must have just slipped your attention because you can see the benefits, right? So there were ways people could use moral persuasion to try to influence prominent members of the local community to subscribe to these Turnpike associations. And it's true that the rate of return on those subscriptions, so if you were buying a share in the Turnpike, as it were, you didn't earn a great rate of return on that investment narrowly conceived, but then they've done empirical studies to show that a lot of the people who were the ones to contribute had businesses that benefited from having that accessibility, right? So that if they were producing something, they need to be able to take their goods to market, to a different market, or if they were going to benefit from the increased traffic of more people coming to their local area. So the point was, these things were provided, right? It's not like there were no roads until the government started building roads. There were private associations that did this stuff, and a lot of the problem of, are we going to make enough money charging revenue to fund the construction? People knew that going into it, and they still did it because, again, they had businesses that would benefit from the increased traffic. As far as, let me just throw out something in case you've never thought of this. One of the main problems with the government provision of roads is that they typically do not charge a high enough price to use them, and so that leads to traffic jams. So one way to think of what is a traffic jam, it is a shortage in terms of economics, right? The price is too low, so the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Too many people are trying to use the expressway at that given time, then there is enough expressway to go around. That's what a shortage is. And so if, the conventional wisdom to say the reason we want the government to provide roads, among other things, is, if somebody owns that road, they could charge whatever they want. I don't want them charging what the market will bear because they'd be ripping everybody off. People got to go to work. Okay, but then don't be surprised when the government charges too low a price and people who got to go to work end up sitting for hours in traffic, which happens in many major cities, right? So if you went through and added up the lost productivity in a major city of people, hundreds of thousands of people wasting hours per day just stuck in traffic, if you had purely private provision, that sort of thing wouldn't happen. Another example, if you've, not just with roads, but with like subway systems. Again, you see the same problem. If you're a sort of claustrophobic person, there are certain times of day, if you're in a major city, you cannot use the subway, at least at certain stops. Like when there's rush hour, people are getting out of work. And I remember when I was a grad student at NYU, there were certain stations, I just knew, don't go to these stations between like 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. because people will literally, the doors will open, people will pile in and they'll get in until the door closes. So they're literally body to body in the volume of this thing. That's not what happens like in a movie theater, right? Even if there's a really popular movie, blockbuster opening night, people don't, it's not you get your seat in the theater and then everyone's like sitting in front of you on your lap. That doesn't happen, right? Because the theater knows to make this good enjoyable, we're going to limit who can get in here. Because part of the experience is to not have people crammed into your face. Same thing with a flight, an airplane. If you buy your ticket, it might be expensive, but you get there and you have some room. It's not that people are literally crammed in your face. Whereas with a subway, at least in certain times of day, that it was like that. And why? Because the incentives are different. That the people running the subway, they don't make more, the actual managers do not get a bonus at the end of the year if they earn more revenue because it's government provided. That would be considered corruption if they pocketed the money because they earn more in tolls or fares. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to get you to see some of the stuff that we take for granted and say, in modern life, traffic jams are just a scourge. It's kind of like tornadoes and earthquakes and there's traffic. No, traffic jams are purely a product of the fact that governments typically provide roads and charge a below market clearing price. So utilities here, the classic argument for why you need government, at least regulation, is that they're what's called a natural monopoly. And so the idea is that because there's high fixed costs and low marginal costs, that it doesn't make sense for there to be multiple competing businesses offering you water service to your house or providing electricity to your house. And so the argument is the standard rationale for private provision, for competitive marketplace provision, breaks down with a so-called natural monopoly. And that's why they say the government should come and either provide it directly or, what is often done, is to have regulations granting some company a monopoly in law, or I should say in legislation, and then, but then regulating how much they can charge so that they can't take advantage of their customers who now only have one company offering them vital things like water and electricity. So here, again, that general principle we talked about before would apply, that you could imagine neighborhood developers working that stuff contractually ahead of time. So like if you're going to go buy a house in a new subdivision, there's a homeowners association perhaps, so there's all kinds of stuff there saying you can't put campaign signs up during a political season, you can't leave a really messed up car on your front lawn, you can't do this, that, and the other thing, you can't play loud music at 2 a.m. because it bothers your neighbors. There's all sorts of things. They could have part of the package of what you're buying if you buy a house in this subdivision is, and we have picked this particular company as the one that's going to provide electricity, and here are the rates they're going to charge. Okay, so so in other words, it doesn't take a coercive local government to do this sort of outcome, if that's really what makes sense. And the benefit is there, the incentives are right, that you're not going to see huge cost overruns, okay, because with the government provision, typically what the regulations say is the electric company will show us their books, what their cost is, and we'll allow them to charge cost plus, plus a little return for their profit. And so the electric company then would have no incentive to keep their costs down because they're just allowed to charge whatever they can show on paper. This is the cost plus some more. Whereas, again, if you had private developers seeking bids from companies to say who's going to come in and electrify our new neighborhood that we're building, our new housing development, the incentives would be right. Another, I think the biggest issue here is what happens, California is doing it right now, experiencing it right now, what happens when the government provides such cheap services for these things without gouging customers, is there shortages, right? So it's actually not a good thing to know that, thank goodness, the government's not allowing the water company to charge whatever the market will bear, because then that means you have things like Governor Jerry Brown coming and telling you how long your shower can be and what you can use, whether you can water your lawn or this or that, the other thing. And electricity as well, where electricity is not even a finite resource, right? It's understandable some people could say, well, water doesn't work the same way that other market-provided goods work because there's a finite amount of it, whereas electricity, that can be produced. So again, the arguments are, I think in my mind, are particularly weak as to why that we need government provision of these things. You don't have, it's not like in the summertime when it's really hot, Budweiser comes out and says, hey, everybody just drink one beer because there's not enough to go around, right? Private companies love it when there's a huge demand for their product, okay? But with water and electricity, that is what happens. There's moral campaigns to say, hey, if you're in an office environment, raise the thermostat. Let your employees not wear coats and ties if you're a business that has that kind of attire, because we got to conserve electricity, right? So that meant this campus, I don't know if you guys, this place is littered with signs saying, this is how much, we're making it so you can't use water. And they're so proud of that. If you go to, if you went to the Jack Daniel's distillery and took a tour, they wouldn't have signs all over saying, we're doing our part to make sure you don't like drinking alcohol, right? So private businesses do not have this mentality. Firefighting, just so you guys know, I had toyed with the idea. I was thinking of this part in the lecture, some of you might be dozing off. I was going to have a bunch of firefighters with their shirts off, but I decided that I didn't know you guys, and that might not be appropriate. So I know you can go Google it if you want. We're a little bit out of time. Let me just throw out some references. Judicial Services. So these last two, judges and police, are clearly the most radical of this stuff. But there have been theoretical and empirical studies, historical studies on what would it mean? How could you possibly have a voluntary provision of what we think of as a judicial system and law enforcement? Let me just, that thing with yesterday, one of the debates, you guys were talking about monopolies. And so I would say it's odd that, people generally think monopolies are bad. And you say, why? Well, because the quality would be low, prices would be high, especially for a really important service. So people would not trust the government to provide cars or computers or oranges, and yet they do trust the government to decide who's going to go to jail for the rest of his life, who's going to get the electric chair. So it's a little bit weird that, as a general rule, people don't trust politicians and other government officials, and yet they're in charge of the justice system. Okay, so now why is that? Because people think, well, I can't imagine how could you have private provision of this stuff. So with the time constraints, let me just throw out some references. The Enterprise of Law by Bruce Benson, that's a book by the Independent Institute. He goes through and develops the theory in the history of some of this stuff. And then there's a new book by Edward Stringham, Private Governance, that's from Oxford University Press. And just one example, this is what Ed talks about a lot as well. There was a time, it's what's called the merchant law developed, because there was a period where merchants from different countries would have to trade with each other. They'd meet at bazaars and whatever and trade goods from different countries. And their respective governments didn't have jurisdiction over each other, right? So like the king of France, it was over here, and this was this and that. And so there was no statutory king's law that applied to that transaction, or it wouldn't, it would take forever. And so they would have, you could call them judges or, arbitrators. So if there was a dispute, if one merchant said, hey, this guy told me he was going to deliver this amount of fish to me, and I paid him, and then I opened it up and they were all rotten, they would take it to some arbitrator who would quickly make a decision based on the facts. And then and there was no force of law. It wasn't like armed men could come and do something to him. But if that merchant who was found to be guilty of fraud didn't pay the restitution, the word would quickly get out, and then all the merchants would know, don't deal with that guy. Because if he rips you off, he's not going to, even if a reputable judge says so, he's not going to make restitution, right? So it was relying on reputational effects. Okay, so that's just one example, again, empirically, of how that stuff could work. So I'm just trying to open your mind to realize even something as conceptually difficult as the legal system. One other quick example, we have rules of grammar. There's not one body that says this is what the rules of grammar are. We have companies that provide books codifying the rules of grammar, but there's no institution in charge of that, and yet we don't have disorderly anarchy in terms of grammar. Everybody knows what a grammatical sentence is or not in general, and then if there's really tough cases, we have experts who can render an opinion and say, what is it? Should we use were or was here? Is the subjunctive mood and things that you might not know, but certain experts have that stuff, and yet there's no one group in charge of grammar. I think I got to stop there. I'll be around all day if you guys have further questions. Thanks.